Good morning and welcome back to our course on the C programming language. In today's session, we are going to discuss about the advantages of functions. The same concept of functions we are extending, and it's a very simple topic where we will be discussing about the advantages of these functions. Before starting, let me have a quick recap of what a function is. So a function is nothing but a set of instructions that are combined to perform a particular task. This we have seen in the previous classes also. But in today's session we will see, right, we have seen the concept of calling a function. Why this calling a function is very important concept means we know that basically the functions are inactive in nature. You write a function definition and you keep it in the program, it will not be executed on its own. That's why I am saying that they are inactive. So you have to make it active. In order to perform this particular task, you have to run that particular function. In order to run that particular function, you have to make it active. So you have to invoke the function. How you are going to invoke the function means by calling those functions. So how we are going to call the functions means we know that by making use of the names of the functions, you can call them. Once you call the function, we have seen lot of examples what happens during the function call. The control along with the variables that are going to be passed from the actual arguments to the formal arguments are passed to the function definition, and then the function is executed. Once the function execution is completed, then again the control will jump back from the call function to the calling function. This and all we have seen in the earlier classes, right? Now my question is, let us take a simple example of the sum function. We will continue the same example. This is the sum function, right? Sum, and we have written the body like this. So the sum function is going to take two values or variables of type integer a and b, and it is going to give the result. My question is, question number 1. How many times you can call this function? How many times can we call this function? The answer is, there is no restriction on the number of times that you call the function. For example, in the previous example I have passed 10 and 20 here, and it is going to give the result as 30. This is the first time I have called, and in the second time what I did is, now I passed the values of 30 and 40. This will give the result as 70, and in the third time I give different parameters like 10 and 30. It will give the result as 40. So like that, the same function sum can be called any number of times. Okay, it can be called any number of times. There is no restriction, there is no hardcore rule or hard thumb rule saying that you should call this function only these many times. There is absolutely no restriction. You can call a function any number of times, or you may not call a function. What is the reason for not calling a function? There is nothing use in it, right? There is no use for it. So you have given a beautiful definition of a function, but you are not calling it. Therefore that function will not be executed. So the task that is performed by that function is never completed. So there is no need of writing a function definition if you are not calling it. In order to make it work, in order to make the function work, you should call it. So you can call a function any number of times. This is the answer you can give. So you can call a function 1 to n times. N can be any time, any value. Right. Now, question number 2. Why? What advantages we will get by these functions? For example, if I have this code, let me write the code here. Int result is equal to a plus b, print the result. So the sum of two integers consists of three statements. If I don't have the concept of functions, I have to write these three statements for the first input, that is 10 and 20. And again I have to repeat. So three statements for this 10 and 20. And again I have to repeat the same set of statements for 30 and 40. Therefore three statements for this 30 and 40. Again, when I change the input to 10 and 30, the same three statements has to be written. Right. So like that, how many number of times you want to find the sum of two integer values, those many times you have to repeat these three statements. This is the case where we don't have the concept of functions. So how many times you want to perform that particular task? All the statements that constitute the that particular task should be written or should be rewritten. Those many times you have to write. So what happens by this one? So in order to get three outputs or three different inputs and three outputs, you have to repeat the same three statements for 3 times. Therefore 9 statements will be there totally. Assume the same case if I call this function 10 times. So 10 into 3, 30 statements has to be rewritten. Of course they are same, but you have to repeat them. 30 statements for 10 function calls. Right. So this particular type of thing, we call it as, the problem is called as redundancy. Redundancy. This term you will come across in the concept of DBMS also. Very important concept. Redundancy is nothing but repeating the same thing is called as redundancy. For example, if you have a file and you have stored that file in 5 different locations, you have a digital file and you store it in C drive, D drive, E drive, and like that you have stored it in 5 different locations. So all these files stored at different locations, the same file is stored in 5 different locations. So we call such type of problem as the redundancy, repetition, right? So this redundancy should be avoided. That can be avoided by making use of these functions. Right, what I did is I combined these 3 statements into a single block like this, and I have named these 3 statements with a common name, that is sum, and I am giving these 2 parameters. So every time I change the input, the same 3 statements are going to execute. Therefore, even though you called this function for 3 times, it is going to, you are going to write only 3 statements. You call this function 10 times, only 3 statements are there. You call this function for 100 times, only 3 statements. Right. So the user is the programmer, not the user. The programmer is freed from writing the same set of statements repeatedly. So in order to avoid the rewriting of the same logic or same set of statements or same code again and again in the program, the functions are being used. So this is one of the important advantage. The first advantage is to avoid rewriting of code again and again. This is one of the important advantages. So if somebody asks you what is the basic advantage of the functions in C, is you can blindly say that it is the functions are used to avoid the rewriting of code again and again. Right. So what is this avoiding rewriting of code again and again means? I'll tell you. Right. The second advantage. What is the second advantage we have is, as I told that how many times we can call this function. The first question I have asked, right? There is no restriction on the number of times a function can be called. So we can call the C functions any number of times in the program and from any place. Any number of times you can call and any place you can call, right? So there is no restriction on the number of times the function is called. Right. And what is the third advantage we have? We have a large problem. For example, you have some 100 lines of code you have to write for a problem. Writing all the 100 lines in a single function will be somewhat difficult to debug the program. For example, I divide this program into 5 parts, each consisting of 20 lines each. Right. So finding errors, that is nothing but debugging, removing of errors from the program which has been divided into number of parts will be somewhat easier than the code which you have written in a single unit. So here the debugging becomes easy because you are dividing the program into smaller units. So smaller units are more capable of debugging them easily when compared to that of the larger units. Right. So these are the 3 advantages you have with the functions. The first advantage is it avoids the rewriting of code again and again. Next one is you can call a function any number of time and from any place you can call it. And the third advantage we have is the debugging becomes very easy because the functions are intended to be written in smaller units. So debugging of smaller units will be very easier when compared to that of debugging the larger parts of the program. Right. So these are the advantages we have basically. And this is the last thing I want to discuss in this topic. When somebody asks you what is the advantage of the function you have, the term that you have to use here is the reusability. To achieve the concept of reusability, we are using the concept of functions. Reusability means you can make use of the same code again and again, any number of times, from anywhere you can call. So all these 3 things, all these 3 advantages can be given under a single umbrella name, that is the reusability. So blindly if somebody asks you what is the advantage of functions, the immediate term you have to quote is the reusability. Functions provide us the concept of reusability. You can make use of the same code again and again. You can make use of the code again and again. Remember, here we are avoiding the rewriting of code again and again. There is no need to write the code again and again, but you can make use of the code again and again. That is the advantage we have. That is called as the reusability. So in today's session we have started our concept of function definition. I have given a brief definition of a function, and then we have seen how a calling of a function happens, why a function is inactive, and how we can make it active, or how we can invoke it by calling the function with the name of the function. We have taken one example, and we have started our discussion with one question like how many times we can call a function. There is no limit. And why we are making use of this function means the main term is the reusability, but in order to expand our explanation, what we have done is to avoid rewriting of code again and again. Number of times the function is called, you can call any number of times a function, and the debugging becomes easy. All these are the advantages we have seen under the concept of advantages of functions. So that's all for today's session on the advantages of functions. Thank you one and all for joining the session.